All right, hey everybody, John Morris here, johnmorrisonline.com, and welcome to another Tuesday Q&A. And in this one, I'm going to be answering several more questions. One of the big questions that I got, obviously the title of this scope is how to learn object-oriented programming in PHP. So I'm going to be covering that. I have several other questions that I'm going to be answering as well. But of course, as we wait for people to jump on here, if you're new to the broadcast, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and saying hi and where you're from so I can see where everybody is from and I can give you a little shout out on the broadcast. Also, obviously this will be up on Periscope for 24 hours, but I do upload these to YouTube as well if you want to come back for the replay at some point. So it's youtube.com/John Morris video. You'll be able to go there and see the replay for this as well. Also, if you know anybody who you think would benefit from the answers to these questions, then especially the OOP question, then if you wouldn't mind swiping up or down, whatever it is on your particular device, and sharing it with them, I'd appreciate that. All right, so again, as people jump on here, let's go ahead and dive into some of the questions because I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Hey guys, you probably heard me talking about the importance of starting your blog to get new clients. And you may have even taken my tutorial at johnsbloggingtutorial.com. But I want to go further and not only help you get your blog started, but also help you get your first few visitors. You know, I found momentum to be such a huge factor in giving you the motivation to keep going with your blog and your web development career. And I want to give you a shot in the arm and get you off to a running start. Now, I'm blessed to have a large and engaged audience. In fact, my YouTube channel is thriving with nearly 100,000 video views per month and over 18,000 subscribers. Plus, my email list grows every single day and is now currently over 23,000 subscribers. All of which translates into 40,000 plus page views of my website each and every month, which is frankly something I never would have imagined just a few years ago. It truly is amazing, and as I mentioned, it's the secret to success behind my entire business. Well, what if I promoted your website to that audience of mine? I'm confident you would pick up a few new visitors and followers of your own, and I wonder how quickly you could grow your audience. Well, that's what I want to find out. Now, to get the details on this and how I can help, you want to head on over to johnmorrisonline.com/publicity. But you'll need to do it before you start your blog. So head on over to johnmorrisonline.com/publicity right away, and let's get you off to a running start with your blog.
All right, so the first question that I got is, there's so much to learn and it's changing all the time with web development. So how do I know where to focus and what to choose to pursue? So I think there's several considerations that you need to look at here. This is actually one of the big things that I think people really struggle with is when they get into web development, is there's so many things that you can learn, there's so many things that you can do, and all of it seems really exciting and fun and has that appeal of learning how to control things on the internet. And we can very easily get caught up in the fun of learning and lose focus on actually building a career for ourselves. And so this is a question that I get asked a lot in a number of different ways. And so there's a lot of things to look at. What I break it down to is I use a very simple 3-step formula that I ask myself constantly. And so these are questions that I'm constantly evaluating and trying to figure out the answer to, and making sure that what I'm doing is in line with the answers to these questions. So the first one that you need to focus on, and some of this sounds silly, but you'll reach a point in your career where this will start to make sense for you. So if it doesn't make sense right now, just hold on to this in the back of your head, and at some point you're going to realize, you're going to come to a point where maybe you feel a little disillusioned, you're not sure where you want to go, you have a lot of uncertainty, and these are going to be your way out of that. All right, so the first one is, what do you love to do? You know, again, there's so many things that you can do. You need to really start to try to identify what you actually like to do, instead of worrying about what you think you're supposed to do, or what the future is going to hold. The reality is there's so much opportunity that there's no reason for you not to do what you love to do. It'd be silly not to, because there's so many things that you can do. And as far as the future is concerned, none of us really have any clue what it's going to be like 5 to 10 years from now. Anybody who says that they know what it's going to be like 5 or 10 years from now, I think is probably lying or deluded, because none of us really know. A lot of the things that have come up in the last 5 to 10 years, none of us could have ever guessed. So I don't spend a lot of time worrying about what's going to come. I know that if it comes, then I'll deal with it as it happens and go from there. So you need to identify what you love to do, because you don't know what the future is going to bring, and there's no reason not to do something that you love doing. So that can be hard to figure out, because there's so many things out there, and the appeal of learning can kind of get you riled up, and you can get caught up in that. But hey, Platinum View, thanks for joining. Good to see you. You can get caught up in the love of learning, and it can throw you off track. But if you continue to evaluate, you'll be able to identify what you love to do. The second thing is something that you're good at. So again, when you're first starting out, that can be difficult. But over time, you'll start to get a feel for what you have a knack for and what you're naturally good at. So that needs to be one of the considerations: what you love to do and what you're good at, or you're willing to get really good at. And finally, what others will pay you for. You do need to pay attention to the market and the things that are marketable out there. But that's not the only thing. So there's plenty of things that you can do in web development that are marketable. So that shouldn't be your only consideration, but you do need to pay attention to it. So what do you love to do that you're good at that others will pay you for? If you can find something that answers all three of those questions for you, then that will help you really gain focus on what it is that you should be doing. And that's what you should pursue, because you're going to have the passion to put in all the work that you're going to need to put in to get good at it and develop it into a career. All right, so hopefully that answers that question for you. Next one is the big one: how do I learn object-oriented programming? Now, the real answer to this is the only way to learn it is to get out there and do it, right? That's with anything in web development. But I do want to try and give you some basic tips here for some things that I know for me when I was first started learning object-oriented programming were confusing, that can hopefully help you get going and get some momentum to where you can actually start doing it and learning it. So the first thing that I think is important is understand what the point of object-oriented programming is in the first place, right? We hear the word thrown around, and if you've never done it and you're new to web development, you hear it thrown around all the time, and you should be doing it, but you don't necessarily ever get a good why. What's the point? Why should I do this versus other scenarios? And there actually are scenarios where object-oriented programming isn't a good fit, despite what the consensus seems to be. Sometimes object-oriented programming isn't the best way to go. Now, those instances are rare, but they do exist. So what's the point of object-oriented programming? Well, one of the main points is to follow the DRY principle, or the DRY tenet, which is don't repeat yourself. And so it's about creating modular code. And by modular, I mean you're creating chunks of code that do very individual specific things that you can use in multiple scenarios. It follows that tenet, which makes it easier to maintain and changes more manageable, and so it scales better. Okay, so the reason a lot of applications are written in object-oriented programming is because of the scalability and the ability to maintain them more easily, because it forces you to think in a way that makes everything much more reusable and modular. Okay, so that's kind of the point. And then what that leads to is you have object-oriented programming classes, or OOP classes, that are written to perform singular functions. Okay, and so an example of that would be WordPress's WP hash. I don't know if that's the exact name of it, but that's the point of it, is to hash a password. And so you give it a password, and what it gives you back is the hash that you need, that you can then use. So it's an entire class built to perform one very specific function, and it can be reused in multiple scenarios over and over and over again. And the reason it's a class is because different scenarios, depending on what parameters are passed to that class, it may need to do different things, right? So it may need to check if the password is of a certain length, as an example. All right, so that's built into the class to handle that. And you don't have to do that in your other code. You can simply build everything that you need into that class for everything that you need to manage for that particular function, and then just pass the data to that class and get back what you need. And so one class for really one major piece of functionality, right? So then what that means is your applications then are collections of classes. So when you're building an application, what you're essentially doing is you're building a bunch of different classes to handle the individual functions that you need for your application. And normally with this, then you have some sort of controller that kind of brings it all together and manages all this. So MVC is a design pattern, an object-oriented design pattern that is fairly common. And the way it works is you have a model, right? That's the M that handles all of the business logic and the data handling and so forth. And then you have a view, which handles creating all of the necessary output. So all of the different views that you might need for output. Then you have a controller, and the controller basically talks to the two, right? It sends data to the model to have it processed in a certain way, and then gets a response back, and then it sends that to the view, and then it gets a response back, and so forth. And so it creates a very modular type setup that can be very, very easily scaled. Right, so then the last thing on this then is one of the things that I think confuses a lot of people is the difference between objects and classes, because you'll hear people use them fairly interchangeably. I even do that in some sense where I'll use them interchangeably. And the difference between an object and a class is, if you think of a house, the class is like the blueprint for the house, and the object is the actual house. So with object-oriented programming, you're going to pass data to a class. What you're really doing there is you're instantiating an instance of an object. So you have these blueprints, you're creating an actual instance of that object with certain data that you've passed to it. And so when you hear people talk about objects and classes, that's really the difference. When you're writing your code, your actual for your application, you're going to be spending most of the time writing your class. But your controller, when you're actually using that class, is going to create an instance of that class that's the actual object, and use that throughout your code. Now, that'll start to make a little bit more sense probably as you start to use it and work with object-oriented programming. But hopefully those things give you some momentum and help clear up some confusing parts of object-oriented programming so that you can move forward with it. Again, ultimately, the answer is you got to get out there and you got to start doing it. And so, if that means going out and looking at existing classes, so finding one and looking at it and seeing how it works. And I obviously, if you're just starting out, I'd recommend with something simple, but doing that, reading through other people's classes and how they work and how they're put together, reading through the manual a little bit after you've done that and you've got a little sense for it, and then, like I said, getting to the point of actually writing code. All right, next question then is, how can I tell if I'm good enough? And this is, again, a question I get quite a bit. I find that developers tend to have, a certain amount of uncertainty. And then there can be people in the community who are not necessarily very forgiving sometimes. And so it adds to that uncertainty. And so I see this question fairly often. So the answer is A, you never are, right? I don't know of a developer that I've met who doesn't feel like they need to learn more, doesn't feel like they need to keep going. I've been at this for over 11 years now, and I still feel like there's a ton to learn. I know people who've been at it longer than that, and they still feel like they have things to learn. So I don't think you ever really feel like you're good enough or that you can stop learning. Now, you do reach a point where you feel confident that you know what you can and can't do. I think that's probably when you know that you've reached a certain level, is that you're aware of what you can and can't do. And when it comes to things that you know you can do, you know you're good at those things. There's certain things that I know I'm good at. But there's plenty of other things that I know I'm not good at. And, if those things were in line with what I love to do and so forth, then I'd have a lot of learning to do in those areas. So again, you never really feel like you're good enough. I think one of the indicators is, or what you should focus on more is, can you build what you need to build, right? That's at that given moment, can I build what I need to build? And if not, can I learn what I need to learn in time to get the project done? And so that's really the balance, is what do I know, and can I build what I need to for a client, for a job, whatever? And if not, can I learn it in time to get it done on time? And if the answer is no to that, then that's probably a client that you shouldn't take, or a project where you should have a discussion with your manager, your boss, or whoever about your limitations and where you're at, and figuring out how to get around that or whatever. But can you build what you need to build? I think that's probably a better indicator than am I good enough? And then the last thing with all this is you just really forget all the naysayers and the people. They're going to be there. Again, I've been doing this for 11 years. I get YouTube comments and blog comments and Twitter tweets almost every single day of somebody telling me how stupid I am or whatever. It's going to happen. So you can't worry about it. You can't let it stop you or let it concern you or let that be your focus. Just forget about it. Read. What I do is I read what they say and I evaluate it without emotion, and to see if there's a valid point there. And if there's a valid point, I pull that out and forget the rest of it. Right? I don't let them make assessments about my character, because they have no idea who I am. They're making that judgment based off maybe a 5-minute video or whatever. So take what's valid and disregard the rest. And if nothing's valid, then just disregard the whole thing. All right, next question is, I've learned HTML and CSS. How do I make the transition into learning PHP, MySQL, and JavaScript? So the first thing that I recommend that you do is I'd recommend going next into JavaScript. And the reason is because it's closely related to HTML and CSS. You're really, what you're doing is you're manipulating HTML and CSS with JavaScript. And so it won't be necessarily a steep learning curve for you, but it will introduce you initially to the idea of programming or scripting. Now, I made this mistake. I actually went into PHP and MySQL after HTML and CSS. And when I went to learn JavaScript, it was really, really difficult because my mind wasn't working. It wasn't oriented the right way. I had got so deep into PHP and MySQL that it kind of threw me off. And so I recommend you go into JavaScript next and then go into PHP and MySQL. And so just a clarification to help you, if you don't know this, so that this helps you get through this process. One, HTML and CSS are the building blocks of a web page. So those are what actually build the web page. HTML is the bones, the CSS is all the styling and the look and feel and so forth. JavaScript then, as I mentioned, manipulates HTML and CSS. So you can create HTML depending on certain factors with your JavaScript. You can manipulate CSS and change the way something looks with JavaScript. So JavaScript manipulates HTML and CSS. And then PHP and MySQL actually allow you on the backside, on the server side, to create HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are client side. They're operating in the browser. PHP and MySQL are server side, so they're processed before that data is ever actually sent to the browser. All right. So again, I would go HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then PHP and MySQL. All right, the last question then is, I'm learning how to work with databases. So what all do I need to learn? So there's lots of different things, obviously, that you learn when it comes to manipulating databases. The core things that you need to learn right now are what's called CRUD. So create, read, update, and delete. These are the core basic functions of working with a database, and that is creating new entries, reading existing entries, updating existing entries, and deleting those entries. Basically, everything that you're going to do with the database revolves around those 4 things. And so that's where you need to start. And that was something, again, when I was learning, I didn't, at that time, and again, this was over a decade ago, there wasn't a ton of information on that, and took me a while to figure out and find on my own. So again, create, read, update, delete. If you get those 4 basic functions down, then you'll have a really, really good start on working with databases. And then a lot of the other stuff is really structuring a class, dealing with errors. It's somewhat auxiliary to those core functions. All right, so that's all of the questions for this week. I want to thank everybody who joined me live, and then everybody who is watching the replay. As I mentioned at the beginning, this will be on Periscope at periscope.tv/JPMorris for 24 hours. You can also, I'll upload this permanently on YouTube at youtube.com/JohnMorrisVideo. If you have any questions for me next week, then you can head on over to Twitter at JPMorris and tweet me your questions there. That's probably the best place to ask me the questions in advance of these broadcasts. All right, that'll do it for this week.
I'm always harping on how important creating content to attract new clients is to you guys. It's how you get your name out there and let people get to know you. It's how you get and keep those people's attention, and it's how you use that attention to get those people to trust you enough to hire you as their developer. In fact, my blog content is the prime mover behind my entire business. Without it, I'd have no business. But I know a lot of you are just starting out or are new to the idea of blogging for your business and aren't sure how to get your blog started. Well, fear no more, because I recently created a blog tutorial where I walk you step by step through starting your blog. From picking your domain name to setting up your hosting to installing your blog software, and every little trick that I've learned along the way the last 11 years to make sure you're set up to be successful with it. Now, it's a completely free, no email sign up or strings attached blog tutorial that you can find over at johnsbloggingtutorial.com. So go check it out, and let's get you blogging and bringing in new clients for your web design business. Head on over to johnsbloggingtutorial.com.